Quick warning, today's video does contain content that some viewers may be sensitive to, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, please go to astheravendreams.com and push the button to do so. And thank you. Back in 2014, I, 24 male, lived in this small apartment complex by myself. The building went in a U-shape, with a park and a pool in the center of it. It had a small playground in it, but it also had some benches and covered spots. I liked to go running or jogging around the building, and then would occasionally sit on one of the benches to cool off before going home. This happened when it was just starting to get cooler out, so I was wearing a light jacket. It was sky blue with a reflective strip down the outside of the sleeves, and I was wearing black sweatpants at the time. Don't worry, it's relevant. After my jog, I sat in my normal spot on the red bench on the far right. I sat there with my head slumped back, just trying to relax and catch my breath. I hadn't been feeling well, but I still wanted to do my normal routine, so it was more like a brisk walk. After a while, I started doing something on my phone, like playing a game or texting a friend most likely, when someone sat on the same bench next to me. He had on jeans and a hoodie, which he had pulled up over his head. I just did a quick take to see who had sat next to me since there weren't many people on the benches, so my initial thought was, really? You had to sit at the same one that I was on? But I just looked back down, continuing to do what I was doing on my phone. And that's when I heard the guy say something, but I couldn't quite tell what it was. So I just looked over at him. He was leaning back on the bench with his arms crossed, and his legs stretched and crossed at the ankles. He stayed in that position, but looked over at me. He had those reflective sunglasses on, so all I could see was the dark stubble on his chin. His hairline looked dark, but I don't know if that was just from the hoodie or not. There was no emotion in his voice as he talked, but without looking away, he said, "She's being held at the Union Building off of 54th. I had no idea what he was talking about, or if I had even heard him correctly, so I just stared at him, curiously. When he didn't say anything, I just said, "What?" He continued looking at me for several seconds when he said, "Really? White jacket?" Which caused me to look down at my shirt. I looked back up at him and said, "Bro, what are you talking about?" This guy then pulls his glasses down a bit, staring at me, and then pushed them back up and immediately got up and walked off like nothing had ever happened. After watching him walk away and out of view, I went back to my phone as I had been texting my friend and I told him what just happened. As I was reading his response, another person showed up at my bench. He put his foot on the bench and leaned over as if he was tying the shoelaces. I looked at his foot, and then back down at my phone with a slight scoff of the situation, when I heard the guy say, "You didn't hear anything." As with the previous conversation, I just looked up at the guy waiting for more of an explanation, but after staring at each other for a few seconds, he just walked off. So, I again told my friend what had happened, and he started coming up with all of these theories. I took it as a joke, but he said maybe I was in the middle of a setup or hostage/ransom situation, and they went to the wrong guy. And like I said, I thought it was just a joke, as this was in some rural city that didn't have a lot of criminal activity, so I just blew it off. One of the last things my friend said to me that night was basically, "Hey, just watch your back," worried that someone might try to get rid of possible witnesses. I blew it off and continued talking to him for a bit, and then decided to head home. My building was on the left side of the U shape, towards the center, and I was at the edge of it, where the park started, so I didn't have much of a walk. However, I started getting the feeling like I was being watched, so I stopped and looked around when I noticed the same guy that was tying his shoe was leaning on a car and staring at me. I was probably just in denial, and I told myself that I was just imagining things and continued to walk home. The buildings have a main door in, and then the doors into the apartments are inside. So, I went into the main door, and as I walked up the stairs, I looked back through the main entrance. I saw that same guy slowly walking by and trying to look into the building. I walked a little faster to my door and went in. Again, I chalked it up to me not feeling 100%, and my friend trying to put things in my head. So I just decided to go to bed. But several times throughout that week, I felt like I was being followed. I never actually saw anyone, but I would go on my walk and would see a random guy by himself, seemingly just standing around. There was a similar looking guy at the coffee shop that I stopped at a few times, and even when I went off site for lunch, I saw that same guy. This really started making me feel paranoid, as I work in a construction area, so if you didn't work in the building or weren't part of the construction crew, there was no reason for you to be around. I told my friend about what I was experiencing, and he told me that I should tell the cops just in case. I told him I would if they kept up or got any closer, but of course it stopped. Not that I wasn't thankful, but it was just really strange that after about a week of this, it all just stopped. I never saw the guys anymore, and I never had any run-ins with anyone at the park. My friend and I still talk about this sometimes because it was so bizarre, and it was pretty creepy after I thought about it more. I don't know what I was part of, but if it was real, someone definitely messed up. But I guess I'm glad they deemed me to be trusting, I guess. I grew up in a family that very much believed in the existence of the paranormal. My grandmother was very religious, and my family ourselves have experienced many things, strange and unusual. We've experienced quite a few unsettling things. I personally have seen shadow people, to waking up to 3 scratch marks running down my back, a shadow entity of some description sitting on my bed when I opened my bedroom door, my sisters reporting seeing similar humanoid shadows. My mother also had a very confronting encounter with some sort of ghost or spirit suddenly appearing in her bedroom, screaming, "How do you know so much about us?" before quickly disappearing as quickly as it came. Due to these instances, there was not much that fazed us. In around 2015, my family experienced what would be one of the strangest and eeriest things in our lives once we pieced it all together. For background, my grandfather escaped Hungary when the Nazis were in the prime of their power, and he came to Australia. His passion was always cooking. Like many chefs, he did have his vices, though. His were cigarettes and horse racing. Even after the indoor smoking ban, he would be regularly caught smoking while doing paperwork in his office, after service in the kitchen was done, or while looking at the day's races looking which horse to bet on. He smoked the strongest tobacco that I had ever tried myself, called White Ox. I started smoking as a teenager myself, however, it was too much even for me. Fast forward to his retirement, he had nothing better to do than gamble and smoke, and he started doing both more, even driving to get more despite his driver's license being taken from him on doctor's orders. In around 2015, he wasn't doing very well. He was struggling to breathe due to emphysema, had cancer, and he was still unwilling to give up cigarettes. He was fine, even though he would have to throw his head back to get a lung full of air. One of my sisters and I were talking in the hallway of our house. We were discussing how I, as his only grandson, could potentially have the best chance at getting my grandfather to come to his senses about his smoking, having kicked the habit myself around a year prior at age 24. Meanwhile, my mother and father are in the living room around 10 meters away. Mid-conversation, my sister and I get interrupted by an extremely loud, drawn-out wolf howl. It was almost deafening, and it lasted for around 10 seconds, though it felt much longer. This shook us quite badly for a couple of reasons. One, we live in the Australian suburbs. There are no wolves native to our area. And two, the sound was coming from between her and I inside the hallway. We freaked out, hairs standing on end, and we ran for the lounge room. We practically burst through the door, my mother and father staring at us in stunned silence while we recounted what just happened. They had heard it themselves, but they assumed that we were playing video games too loudly or watching YouTube. Skip forward a couple of weeks. My grandfather is now in and out of the hospital with his breathing issues, and eventually, it got so bad that he ended up there full time, with 2 breathing tubes in his mouth, feeding oxygen down into his body to keep him alive. At around the same time as he was being admitted via ambulance to the hospital, for this now much more serious progression in his illness, I was in my bedroom listening to some creepypastas on YouTube, trying to keep my mind off of things for a while. In between scenes in a story, I hear people running around the house, talking frantically to each other. I assumed they were just being dumb, chasing each other around when my mother opens my bedroom door and nervously asks, "Did you hear that howl?" I told her no, as I had been wearing headphones at the time. She explained to me, now accompanied by the same sister who heard the first one and my father, that it was almost identical to how we described the first time that we heard it in the hallway. Only this time, it was in the lounge room with 2 new people to witness this odd phenomenon. Around 3 weeks later, my grandfather is finally showing signs of strength, and they have now removed the breathing tubes so he can breathe on his own. But he has otherwise shown barely any improvement in his condition. Back at home, after we had all been to see him, the whole family, including the older of my 2 sisters, were eating our fast food dinner in the lounge room. She had not heard the howling yet. That changed that night. Now, with all 5 of us present in the lounge room, the howling wolf decided to make itself known one last time. This, like previous times, was just a single howl. This one was just as loud as the others, just as drawn out, but had an almost scream-like quality to it, as if the wolf was in pain. Needless to say, all of us collectively lost our minds. We all were covered in goosebumps, and the surge of energy and adrenaline that comes from a fight-or-flight response to an event. It was only around a week after this that my grandfather passed away in the hospital. We didn't think the events were related at the time. Talking about it afterward, however, we put it all together. The howling, his sickness, and the fact that we had never heard it before or since does make me wonder what exactly this meant. Was it a sign of his upcoming death? Was it a hellhound? Was it a friendly spirit come to escort him to the afterlife? Since talking it over with each other, we still get chills to this day thinking about the wolf spirit that took our grandfather. Although very amateur, I consider myself an avid ghost hunter. I love listening to and reading ghost stories, as well as watching a few shows on TV. I can only tolerate some of them, though, as I felt others were over dramatized and made the real ones look watered down. I love looking for old abandoned places or haunted buildings to explore. Thankfully, I was never alone in my ventures. I had two other friends that were just as enthusiastic as myself. Rachel and Harlan were typically with me in every building that I went through. I got a bonus at work, so I treated myself to a new and better EMF reader and a digital audio recorder. I had just been using either the recorder or a spare smartphone, or a cheap battery-operated tape recorder, and I had been wanting a professional one. Of course, once I received them, I was itching to go somewhere to try it out, but I wanted to go somewhere new. So, after some discussing and planning, the three of us decided to check out a building that was supposedly haunted. We learned about this building through a site with a list of abandoned places in our area. There were comments saying that it definitely had some paranormal activity going on, and, for the most part, it wasn't monitored or guarded, and there were no signs saying you couldn't enter. So, we decided to go forward with it. The night comes for our adventure, so Rachel and Harlan meet at my place so we could all drive out there together. When we arrived, there wasn't really much in the way of a parking lot or a driveway because of how old it is. So we parked on the side where the grass seemed to thin out. The outside itself looked like it could tell a story all on its own. It looked like a small castle. It was made of brick that looked in between a light gray to a white. It had rounded corners with really nice-looking arched windows. The side that we parked on looked like it shifted some, like it was starting to sink or maybe fall, but it didn't look like it would be a safety issue, so we still went in. It had a heavy wooden door that opened inward. We had to push on it pretty hard, as it seemed to catch on the floor due to it being slanted because of the time that had passed. I mention this to keep in mind that it takes a little force to get it to move. I started by pulling out the camera that I had to do an intro including who all was here and where we were. Then, I gave Rachel my EMF reader to use as Harlan had his own, and I set up my new recorder. We all stayed together to walk through the bottom floor. The living room still had an old couch in it. It had dust on it, but it looked like it had been disturbed recently. It was entirely possible, as others have checked this place out before, but there was still the idea that someone else could have been nearby. That was kind of unsettling. There was a huge frame that hung above the fireplace, but whatever was in it had been cut out. There was a small kitchen with an old-style oven in it, and then we saw a room that was pretty much empty, but it had bookshelves on all sides. I think it may have been some kind of library or study of some sort. We weren't getting any hits on the EMFs, so we decided to move upstairs. The second floor had a wide walkway that actually looked over to the bottom floor near the front door. To the right of the stairs was another small room that looked like a den. There weren't any doors, and there was another doorway on the opposite side. We started to go towards the left, which had, I believe, 4 doorways. One was to a pretty simple bathroom with a single disconnected tub. It had a curtain that seemed to go around it, but the bars that held it seemed to have been eaten by rust and were barely standing. The next door led to a smaller bedroom, and judging by the decor, it belonged to a child. The trimming was a light pink or purple with a floral pattern carved out of it. There was no electricity in the place, so the only source of light was our flashlights that we were carrying. Nothing was really of interest there, so we moved on. One of the other rooms must have belonged to the adults or the owners of the house. There was a large bed frame in the center of the room, as well as a walk-in closet that actually still had a few things hanging up. Rachel moved the clothes, and as she did this, I got a strong smell of perfume. By the look on her face, I could tell that she could smell it too. I figured it just came from the clothes, but she opened one of the jackets and smelled the inside and said she couldn't smell it. We just figured it was an odd occurrence and moved on. Rachel was still looking through the closet, and I went back to the room to look around and ask questions like, "Is anyone here with us?" Harlan was with us up to this point, but then he said he was going to go on ahead to the next room. Not long after this, I hear the beeping sound from that EMF reader, and Rachel came walking out of the closet showing me the screen. We began asking more questions, but the only response coming out seemed to be static. Sometimes we could hear words, or parts of them, but this was just garbled. So, we continued asking questions in hopes of getting answers that made sense. Rachel and I left the room we were in, and went to the one Harlan was in, and his EMF reader had been going off as well. That room, it seemed a bit more generic. The walls looked an off-white, there was a smaller bed frame with a nightstand next to it, and otherwise the room was pretty empty. We all went to the last room together, and both readers were going crazy. But what was weird to me was that there was nothing in this room but a chair. It looked like an old rocking chair, but the rocker part was broken and rotted out, so the chair was leaning on one side. I told Rachel to set the reader on the chair on a whim, and when she did, it stopped. Harlan's was still going as he held it, though. We began asking more questions like, "Was this your room? Are you still here? Did your life end here?" and so on. Then, Harlan's reader stopped too. We stood there for several minutes after that, waiting to see if something else happened. But there was nothing. Rachel really enjoyed this. Like, she never hesitated on going on one of these adventures. But Harlan almost got into these more than I did. So when all the activity stopped, it seemed to upset him. Like we had just lost a big catch. So he decided to go outside for a few minutes to gather his thoughts, and to get something from my car. Rachel and I stayed in the room to see if we could get anything back. She asked for the recorder and began asking questions, and just talking aloud. After a series of questions, we heard what sounded like Harlan standing in the hallway and talking. I remember hearing, "This is messed up. What are we doing here?" Rachel and I looked at each other, just kind of smirking, as it was, one, unusual for Harlan to not feel comfortable in these situations, and two, something we've never really heard him say before. Rachel called out for him, and when there was no response, she started walking towards the doorway and looked around. She said Harlan was nowhere nearby, so I walked over to her to confirm this. And that's when we heard a loud slam, followed by banging and Harlan yelling. We quickly started running down the stairs when I noticed the door was closed. We both stopped at the bottom of the stairs. For myself, it was definitely out of confusion. But it couldn't have been more than a few seconds before I started walking towards the door, and then it came flying open with Harlan on the other side. He had a look of confusion and anger, maybe more so annoyance, when he gave us the normal spiel of, "That wasn't funny, guys." We had to convince him that it wasn't us, because we were still upstairs until we heard him talking, and then heard the slam. It seemed the talking is what got him to believe us. We explained what we had witnessed, and he said he experienced something quite the same. He heard what sounded like Rachel talking, and me laughing when the door shut. He was trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge, until it seemed like it was pulling him back into the house as it flew open. And that's when the conversation turned to said door. It was slightly off, and very heavy. Rachel definitely couldn't move it herself, and if Harlan or I tried to, it took effort, as you had to hold it up as you moved it. So it wasn't possible to move it so quickly. He was definitely in agreement at that point, but then we explained to him that we heard his voice as well. He confirmed what we were already thinking, which was, he never went back upstairs either. Something was definitely mimicking our voices. We decided to leave since the door slammed, thinking maybe we were upsetting something, but made plans to go back with more equipment, like a thermal camera. A few days after our trip, I decided to go through the audio that we had gotten to see if maybe we could make out some words from the garbled mess. To my amazement, there was nothing the whole time we were trying to talk to it, until we were outside with Harlan. I could hear parts of our conversation with him, but when we stopped talking and there was presumably dead air, you could clearly hear on the recording, "Welcome to my home." We heard nothing of the sort while we were standing there. I showed this to the other two, and they agreed. We do have plans to go back, as mentioned, but Harlan was in an accident, so just as soon as he is out of his cast, he wants to go. And I will be sure to share anything else that we experience. Back in 2016, one of my best friends was getting married, and she wanted me to be her maid of honor. I was so ecstatic for them, as her girlfriend was a sweetheart, and if there ever was a couple that was meant for each other, it was them. There was no way that I was going to miss it, so I made plans to drive out there. They moved to Michigan, and I was living in Wisconsin. They had already gotten themselves a nice little house, so thankfully I was invited to stay with them, which also meant that I didn't have to leave my little pup Lenny at home. He was a shelter rescue that my mom had been fostering, and I fell in love with him. I was working on training him, so I didn't want to leave him with my mom or anything and lose the progress. I couldn't afford to take the boat across the lake, so I was planning on driving around it, which meant about 7 to 8 hours on the road. That wasn't a big deal, though, as I was a grade school teacher and we were on summer breaks, so I had no real time restraints either. So, I packed up my things, and I headed out for a great week. I was actually looking forward to sightseeing, and since I had left ahead of schedule, I was able to make my own stops along the way. I may have also gotten carried away and lost track of time too, as it was starting to get late. I made sure to have extra money so that I could stay at a hotel, either on my way there or home. I thought I would drive as much as my eyes could stand. That way I had less to drive the next morning and more time to explore. I was planning on going another hour or so, but Lenny started whimpering. He was still young, so I knew I was going to have to pull over as soon as possible. The road was pretty empty where I was, and maybe it was because it was so late, so I stopped on the shoulder that had some trees and grass on the other side of the guardrail. I carried Lenny over the side and stood next to him, stretching some while holding on to the leash. I suddenly started getting this weird feeling, like I wasn't alone, like I was being watched. It was odd because I was on the side of this random highway with no one else around. I looked around the trees, though, thinking maybe there was a deer or other wildlife in the area that I was honing in on, but I couldn't see anything. Then I noticed that Lenny seemed to be doing the same thing. I watched as he scanned the field in front of us and did a double take in the direction of one cluster of trees. I tried focusing as much as possible to see if I could see something, when all of a sudden I saw a small figure run between two trees. It startled me, so I gasped a little and immediately looked down at Lenny, He kept turning his head to the side and whimpering. I was not comfortable with this situation, especially since Lenny was confirming that something was there, so I snatched him up and rushed back to my car and drove off. Lenny sat up, looking out the window, going back and forth from the front to the back, like he was trying to find something. It definitely was not making me feel any better, so I wanted to keep going until he stopped, thinking maybe if he couldn't sense it anymore, then I was safe to stop. When he finally gave up, I stopped at the next exit for a hotel. Unfortunately, I kept running into ones that had no vacancy or no pets allowed, and the one that did was way too expensive for me. So, I decided to find a well-lit parking lot and just sleep in my car. I found a grocery store that was closed, but had lights in the parking lot, so I parked in the furthest one in the back, took Lenny out one more time, and then positioned myself to sleep for the night. The next morning, I started waking up and was still in that half-asleep, half-awake state, and I could hear the nearby trees moving from the wind, or other cars passing by, but was still trying to sleep while I could since I wasn't hearing Lenny yet. But then, I started hearing what sounded like whispering. Again, feeling like I was asleep still, I thought I was just dreaming. All I was seeing was darkness and hearing whispers. Some were louder than others, like they were closer, but all were incoherent. I couldn't make out any words or conversations being had, until I heard, "Wake up," being clearly whispered in my ear. It was almost as if I could feel the air being pushed by my ear. Not only was this whispered, but it also felt like someone had yanked on my arm. This made me jump up immediately to see that I was still in my car, alone, besides Lenny, who was now wide awake looking out my window behind me. I turned around and didn't see anyone there, or anything there. I sat there for a minute gathering my thoughts and catching my breath. The sun was just coming up because it was still a little dark, but there was no way that I was going to be able to sleep anymore, so I set off. I found a McDonald's close by and stopped so we could both gather ourselves and get ready for the rest of the drive. Between the night before and my abrupt awakening, I was done with Michigan, and I was ready to get to my destination. I made minimal stops along the way, and when I finally arrived, I teased them about Michigan being haunted and explained to them what had happened. They had no explanation at the time for the things in the trees, but they said that the place I stopped to sleep in was known as the dangerous part of town. Lots of break-ins, robberies, and there was even one store that was set on fire due to a disagreement between employees and management. So, they teased it was probably a spirit protecting innocent people in the area, and it was trying to get me out of there. It was really weird, and that's where I left it. I was indifferent when it came to the paranormal because I had never experienced anything, but I don't know how else to explain what happened. The wedding, the after-party, all of it was fun, and very little went wrong or was stressful. It was a good time after that, but I made sure to leave early so I could get home the same day, because I didn't want any more run-ins with whatever was living out there. Now, the reason that I was reminded of this was because I was watching a video on YouTube with different cryptids by state, seeing if there were any interesting ones in Wisconsin, when I learned about melonheads. They were apparently seen in a few different states, and one of those was Michigan. It was mentioned that they escaped the Felt Mansion, as they were being tested on there, and now they live in the woods, attacking people. I wasn't far from where the mansion was, and all I could think about was the thing in the woods. Did I encounter a melonhead by chance? It still doesn't explain the weird whispering. All I know, though, is that the next time we get together, they're either coming to me, or I'm saving up to take the boat across the lake. I love riding my bike at night. Being able to go out with no music and just listen to the night sounds, it was always so therapeutic for me. I didn't need any music to drown out the other people or cars passing. I could listen to the wind as it weaved through the trees or ran through my hair. I could listen to the crickets chirp and the frogs croak in the creek running along the side of the road, or even just the sound of my tires spinning as I glided along the road. I worked a later shift, so I was usually home around 9 or 10 p.m. I'd go change and then head out for an hour or so before I went back home to shower and go to bed. On this night, I didn't have to work the next day, and I was really itching for something new. So I decided to ride a little further and off the path that I normally took. I went around the block as I normally do, cut across the street, and passed the gas station. I was now further than I had ever really gone. I didn't feel uneasy or nervous, though. I actually almost had a second wind in me, exploring a new area. There was an underdeveloped area nearby, as new homes were being built, so I told myself I would ride around in there and then start heading back. That way, I didn't wear myself out, making the ride back exhausting. I was going over all of these newly paved roads, making it one of the smoothest rides that I've ever been on. It also made it extremely quiet to where it was just my tires and the crickets in the distance. Until I started hearing singing, or humming, rather. At first I thought it was just another person enjoying the night, until it finally registered where I was. There were no houses here yet. It was just the road along the outside of the soon-to-be homes. There were a few foundations laid out, and frames set up, but no actual houses. Why would there be people around? I slowed down a bit so I could hear the singing better. The song sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was just the music, though. As I mentioned, no lyrics. As I went around the bend, the humming got louder, and I could make out the song. It was Stand By Me. I could almost sing along with it, with how good the humming actually was. I stopped my bike and began to look around between the few construction machines and frames with the flashlight on my phone. As I walked past one of the plots and around a pile of dirt and rocks, I could see a woman sitting in the dirt swaying from side to side. I just stood there for a few seconds watching and listening to her. The song came to an end, and after a few seconds, she just started singing again. My clumsy ass, however, missed the dip in the ground in front of me, causing me to stumble a bit. When I did this, I of course made a gasp, and there was probably a sound as I tried to regain my balance. All of this was enough to cause her to stop singing and swaying. She slowly stood up but never turned around to face me. The whole situation was pretty eerie, but I didn't really feel scared until she stood up. My fight or flight instincts kicked in, and I immediately apologized and turned around to go back. As I kicked the stand and got back on, she began screaming. It made me jump, and I took off as fast as I could on the bike. The whole time, she continued screaming as I rode away. Even after I was out of the new neighborhood, I could still hear her screaming in the distance. I crossed the street, so I was on the same side of the lights the way home, and when I got there, I quickly put my bike on my patio instead of my garage like usual, ran inside, and locked the door. I've told a few friends about this, and we all laugh about it now, but holy hell, that was one of the creepiest things I have ever experienced. And no, I haven't gone back, but there are a few houses there now. And I guess good luck to them. So this was the second collection of Unexplained horror stories, scary stories on my channel. Stories that are just kind of weird. Just really unthemed, really unexplainable stories. Ones that are just kind of like, what the hell am I listening to? And that's the whole intent, right? Unexplained stories are supposed to be weird, creepy, terrifying, and ultimately unexplained. And I hope you enjoyed this collection of stories, and if you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, consider hitting the subscribe button, and leave me a comment down below letting me know how you're doing on this beautiful Saturday. Hopefully it's good. Hopefully you're staying cool out there in parts of the world where it's hot, or in parts of the world where it's cold. Hopefully you're staying warm. Yeah, all that stuff. Anyways, if you want to support further, you can hit the join button down below, or go to Patreon, where for $1 a month you can get early access to content like this as it comes out. Always appreciated, never ever expected, just so you know. Yeah. I don't really have much else to say. Other than just, hope you're having a great weekend. Hope everything's going well for you. Hope any plans you had for this weekend go swimmingly. Hope they go smooth. And that's pretty much it. I hope that I will see you on the next video. But of course, my friends, much love, and sleep well.